Of course, when I got home, nobody was there. The answering machine had two messages. Dad would be home by 8 p.m., and I should eat without him. Well, duh. And Mom and Jeffrey would be staying at the hospital another night, but I should call my mom's cell phone ASAP. Now, here was an interesting dilemma. Should I call and face the problem, or should I not call and enjoy a few hours of lonely, nerve-wracking boredom instead of my usual lonely, depressing boredom? I pondered that for about 7/10 of a second before finally going downstairs to play drums until dinner. While I was in the basement playing, it occurred to me that my mom might worry that she didn't hear back from me, and I just wasn't in the mood to consider someone else's feelings at the moment. Unfortunately, it didn't occur to me that my mom might completely spaz and send my dad home to check on me. Imagine my surprise when the basement lights went out. I stopped playing, took off my headphones, and jumped up. The light went back on. When my eyes readjusted, I looked straight at the vengeful glare of an enraged accountant. Stephen, it's 6:30. What are you doing? Playing drums? Why didn't you call your mother when you got home? Why should I have? She's just going to yell at me for getting mad for my math grade, right? You should have called her because when you didn't, she was afraid you disappeared or something, and she had me paged out of an important meeting, and I came charging home. This cost us about $200, and we don't have $200. That was irresponsible, Stephen. Oh, irresponsible. That's like the dirtiest word an accountant can possibly say to his kid. I knew things were at a crucial point right now. What I said next would likely determine whether I'd be grounded until marriage or just lectured for a while and then ignored. But every once in a while, when you don't make the safest choice when you're 13. Irresponsible? Irresponsible, Dad? You really want to talk about irresponsible? I don't think you do. Who's this super responsible guy who hasn't actually talked to his firstborn son about anything in about 4 months? Who's a pillar of responsibility who has left his 13-year-old to fend for himself for weeks on end? When was the last time you asked me about school, responsible man? When was the last time you were went shopping for any food and cooked anything that couldn't be cooked without using 2 minutes of radiation? Stephen, that's not fair. Fair? You banished me to the old folks' home for a week. You want to talk to me about fair? Stephen, you know we had to take care of your brother. Now I was in full-on attack formation. It was like playing some kind of Dad Devastator 3 video game or something. I couldn't stop saying the coldest, meanest things that popped into my head. Who had to take care of my brother? Have you been playing board games with him every night instead of studying for school? Have you been kneeling with him in front of the toilet every time he throws up? Have you been sleeping in the hospital with him? Have you? I stopped for a moment and looked up at my father. Truthfully, I was kind of surprised he hadn't smacked me yet. What I saw wasn't quite what I would have expected. He sat down heavily on the basement steps, and his head was bowed. He looked up like a dog does right after you whack it with a newspaper. Dad? Dad? His voice had a howl whisper in it and that I hadn't heard before, and I hope I never hear again. You're right, Stephen. You're 100% right. I have not been talking with you. I haven't been taking care of anybody. I haven't since your brother's, since October. This is the longest string of words he had uttered in months, but it suddenly dried up as if he just couldn't find any more to say. And then he looked at me with his tenderness that was also new to me, stood up and held his arms open. I know this sounds weird, right in the middle of a fight and all, but I ran right into my dad's chest. After he held me for a while, I tried to speak. Dad, I don't want Jeffrey to. Then I cried until it was time for an embarrassment burritos and a long call from Mom to Dad. When my father hung up, he looked much more like my old dad, my pre-October dad. He was still kind of talked out, but there was one more thing in his accountant brain. So about that math grade. The next day, Mom and Jeffrey came home, and we walked in. They encountered a scene that must have been fairly surprising. My dad and I were playing chess at the kitchen table, and there was a pile of math stuff on one of the extra chairs. Dad had spent a couple of hours that morning getting me 2 chapters ahead in algebra. After I explained the whole Rene Albert tutorial fiasco, he had felt sorry for his pathetic eldest son. You sometimes forget how good your parents are at things. I mean, my dad did math for a living, 365 days a year, so it really made sense he knew the stuff. But I mean, he really knew the stuff. Then, when we were done, we celebrated with my first cup of coffee ever and a game of chess. Weird. My parents would never have let me had coffee before Jeffrey got sick. If there's one thing I'd figured out about having family crises like ours, it's the old rules no longer apply. For example, I had probably gone 4 months without eating a single vegetable, but there were times when I wished for new rules that did apply, like maybe take a vitamin every day so you don't get scurvy. I got all hyped up from the caffeine and won the game in about 9 minutes. So my father got a chance to be impressed with me too. And then when my mom and Jeffrey sat down at the table, it was like some kind of normal family moment or something, until my mom remembered she was mad at me. She asked my dad to take Jeffrey into the living room for some father-son bonding. Old dad was having quite the paternal morning, and then began lacing into me. But before she could build up a good head of steam, I cut her off and explained how hard I'd worked on the grade, how disappointed in myself, how I had turned away the world's most desirable math tutor for the sake of Jeffrey's health, and how Dad and I had already had it out about not calling Mom's cell phone incident. What could she really say? Stephen, I love you, but never ever do this again. There, I could live with that. The rest of the weekend was pretty tranquil for a change. Jeffrey was on a new anti-nausea medicine, and the doctors had lowered his steroid dose. So he was feeling well enough to play more actively. Also, thanks to my little mini drama, both parents were really looking at me and even asking me questions about life. Probably the coolest part was my drum lesson with Mr. Stoll. On Saturday afternoon, my mom drove me instead of sleeping, which was her usual post-hospital routine, and watched the whole lesson instead of going shopping or something. Afterwards, she told me she had no idea how good I had gotten. It felt pretty nice to know that my last 4 months of practicing Pad Manic had made a notable difference. As things turned out, it was a good thing my mom had watched that particular drum lesson, because it would be the last one we would be able to afford for a long while. On Sunday, my cousins from New York came over, which they hadn't done in ages. My mom had called them when she noticed that Jeffrey was suddenly having a couple of good days, and her sister had dropped everything to come see us while the opportunity lasted. I'm the oldest kid in our whole extended family, so I generally run around keeping the little ones from killing each other, but that day they all got along. I sat on our back porch drinking hot chocolate, thinking about Rene Albert, and watching my brother and the cousins pound each other with snowballs for about 40 minutes. An endurance record for Jeffrey this year. When they came in, we had a real family-style dinner. My mom even dusted off that big thing in the kitchen called a stove. The people were laughing and joking around like we used to last year. I mean, an outside observer would notice that there was a puffy bald kid there, and that grown-ups kept pausing to look furtively at him, but the mood was lighter than it had been since the diagnosis anyway. Jeffrey even got my Uncle Neil to do his famous impression of Captain Peter Pan and Captain Hook fighting over dessert, which he only did once a year. It was really nice time. Then Jeffrey started falling asleep at the table. I guess all the running around had been tough on his body. The adults were all taking their time over coffee, and the cousins were in the family room watching SpongeBob. So I took Jeffrey up to bed. Even though he was only half awake, I got him to go pee and brush his teeth. Then we went into the room to get his PJs on. He took off his shirt and I gasped. His arms were an alarming color of dark bruises. I hadn't thought of it at the time, but I guess all of his snowballs hitting him had taken a toll, even though he was wearing a thick winter coat. He glanced up at me, this look of total resignation that should never be on a 5-year-old's face. I felt so bad for him that I read him 2 chapters of his favorite book, Flat Stanley, before I turned off his light. Later on, after the guests left, I said goodnight to my parents and got ready for bed, to go to bed myself. I had been in a nearly great mood for about 36 hours, but unease was settling back in. When I was lying down all alone in the dark, I couldn't get comfortable for the longest time. I just kept seeing Jeffrey's arms over and over in my head, and it hit me. I had been in dream world for a day and a half, but just because you get distracted by the silver lining for a little while doesn't mean that there isn't still a huge dark cloud behind it.